Hi, this is Henry Chamberlain. Welcome to another Comics Grinder. Today I have a great treat for everyone. I'm going to speak with Leela Corman, an artist and cartoonist. We're going to be discussing her new work, Victory Parade. Let me start, Leela, by asking you what is Victory Parade about?
So Victory Parade takes place in a couple of time periods and places. It's set partially in 1943 in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and in Brooklyn in general. So this is during the Second World War. And there's a second part of it that is set at the liberation of Buchenwald, which took place in April of 1945. And then there's a little bit of an addendum to that. So it's set at the kind of at the tail end and immediately after the Second World War. And it's about women working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It is about the ways that individuals process collective trauma. It's about the meeting ground of the living and the dead. So there's a lot of parts that take place in kind of the dream state or the death state. And it's also intended to be an anti-fascist work of art, which I was working on it in the last, I started working on it in 2016, so it's been quite a ride.
Well, I have some selected pages that I wanted to share with folks, and that will bring together what you just beautifully said. I wanted to ask you, well, let me just, for folks that are not familiar with the previous book, these are two books from the same publisher, and I believe it's a triptych. So you have another one that's going to come out at some later date. But what led you to do Victory after doing Unterzakhn? What led you to do Victory Parade? Or is it like some grand plan in your mind as to how you're doing these?
No. I mean, that's just not how the creation of art works. I finished Unterzakhn and I had a long period where a lot of things happened in my life that I won't belabor right now. But if you know me or my story, you know what happened kind of around the time Unterzakhn came out. So I had to spend a lot of time recovering from that. And then my practice really changed. So I was living in a different city than the one where I had mostly worked on Unterzakhn. I had left New York City and we were living in Gainesville, Florida. I was starting to teach. I was teaching a lot of illustration at the time and really kind of concepts, and also teaching at SAW, so starting to get a handle on teaching storytelling to people. And so I started really, when I kind of came back to making comics again after the fallow period, after finishing the big long book, I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do. I was just kind of casting around for stuff to work on. And I was having this conversation with Vanessa Davis about, I was lamenting how I never have ideas for short nonfiction comics that I could pitch and like pay the rent with. And she said, you just told me like 3 stories that would totally be great pitches. And she was right. And that I have Vanessa to thank for telling me that my ideas were pitchable, because that is exactly what happened in my career starting in 2013 and really going into the current time frame, although I'm stepping back from it for a little while now, I say. But that started a long process of short comics that I did that allowed me to experiment with mark making and with bringing in color and different kinds of media to get to a place where I felt like I understood whatever my style was evolving into. Now I say that, but the thing is that there were a couple of points along the way where I thought I had it figured out. The big pivotal moment though was in 2015 when I did this piece for Nautilus magazine about post-traumatic stress and the neurobiology of trauma. And I decided to start working on it in watercolor. I've always been kind of naturally good at watercolors. I never really studied it. So I didn't, I usually didn't use it in my work. It was just sort of something I had in my back pocket. But as soon as I started painting my comics in watercolor, it was like the portal between life and death opened and all of this stuff poured out. It also put me on a path that I had thought was closed off to me, and put me back on a path that I thought was closed off to me of being a painter. So that was a big deal. And so I wasn't really thinking about Victory Parade, although I kind of had it in the back of my mind, because the initial kind of image that sparked the idea came in 2013 while I was still pregnant with my daughter, Molly Rose. But the reliable pattern with ideas like that for me is that I'll have the key image and I'll make a note of it, because I've gotten to the point where I understand when a key image shows up, that's what it is, and I have to make sure I remember it. But I also always know that if I am too close to finishing a previous project, then I don't really know yet how to make the new project. It's not time. So I had it in my kind of percolating away in the back of my mind. And then I started kind of trying to figure out, around 2015 or so, I started trying to figure out, what's my next long project going to be? Because the long projects are fictional. The short ones are nonfiction so far. So I had a kind of a few candidates, and the narrowing down process happened kind of going into 2016. So by about the middle of 2016, that's when I knew what Victory Parade was going to be roughly, and what it was going to be about, and I was able to craft the pitch for it.
Well, great. When I say grand plan, that sounds like a marketing department scheme, but I know what you say. I do fully appreciate it. There's so many places we could jump into. I'm just going to leaf through a few beautiful pages here, and well, it begins with the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and with a rosy derivative type of feel, which I think is a wonderful way very accessible for readers, and as you're curious of what's going on, and then we discover it's a much deeper story than just that, than rosy derivative. Now there's parallels between Unterzakhn and Victory Parade, which I wanted to, if you want to chat about them, I think about, for instance, there's this character who's a war veteran amputee, and he's in an extramarital affair. There's a character like that in Unterzakhn, and there's a character like that in Victory Parade, and that it's just such a wonderful duality going on, parallel. Could you say something about those? I guess they're just organic. They just happen.
Yeah. I mean, it was funny. I had to laugh after I had written it all, and I realized, oh, I just did that twice.
Mm-hmm. But so well, so deliciously well.
Thank you. Well, clearly there's something there. I think the best thing about making any art in any medium is that you're creating mysteries for yourself. You create more questions than answers in your work. I think a lot of us are doing that, and then you come out, you're done, you come out of it and you go, oh, wow, look at all those mysteries that I just made. Look at all those questions that just arose.
Yeah. Well, artists and non-artists can appreciate that, can understand what you're saying. And then the other one we have to bring up, it's like the elephant in the room, the Meyer Birnbaum character. He appears in both.
Oh, he's not an elephant. I can talk. I love to talk about Meyer Birnbaum.
Well, I say that playfully, and he seems like a real magical realism character, because he doesn't seem to age. Because he's like a middle-aged guy, and then again, 30 years later, he's still the same age, more or less.
I tried to age him a little, but I think it didn't really come through in the paint. I tried to make his hair a little whiter. But you're onto something there, because Meyer Birnbaum, so in Unterzakhn, Meyer Birnbaum, I did not write him. He appeared, and he wrote himself. In this book, I had to push him a little bit more, but I don't remember exactly the moment that I decided to bring him back, but I think it was pretty early. It made complete sense that he would be a wrestling promoter by the 1940s. And and still kind of, he's still a sideshow guy.
Yeah.
That's what he's always going to be. But what I realized in bringing him back for the second book is that he is my tribute to a Gilbert Hernandez character, Gorgo.
Oh.
So, the character of Gorgo in Gilbert Hernandez's Palomar stories. He's the old man who protects the family of Maria and then Luba, Maria's daughter. And he never dies, no matter how badly beaten or shot he is, or what happens to him. Somebody throws him off a bridge. He does age. He does seem to age more slowly than other characters. He's sort of always an old man in a lot of the stories, but he never dies, no matter what you do to him. And I thought Meyer, Birnbaum, and Gorgo, there's a lot of homages to the Hernandez brothers in my work, like throughout. And a lot of that happens unconsciously, but that one was conscious.
Yeah. Now, I wanted you to maybe talk to us about the characters. I mean, the protagonist is Rose, and yet Ruth is like they're kind of both in there together. And then there's Eleanor, who's more of a modest character, but she has her own story to tell. So it's basically these two strong women and a younger woman. Can you talk about that dynamic?
Well, I guess in practical terms, this is the Second World War, so there aren't a lot of men around of a certain age. Most of the men between in a certain age bracket are overseas in the military. So women are working in factories, and this was the beginning of a lot of work experiences for women, including not having childcare, which that was not in the scope of this book to talk about, but it certainly came up in my research. How would women working in munitions factories or airplane factories have care for their children? It was really rough. I mean, it was just a very organic outgrowth of telling stories about human beings. I think another kind of pattern that was, I want to say it's a reliable pattern, but I mean, I don't know if it's going to happen next time. It happened with Unterzakhn and it happened with Victory Parade, that I had a first idea, a first character, and then a second character came in later. And that sort of second character B plot story became more interesting to me. So in Unterzakhn, it's Esther's story that got a lot more focus, and I thought it was going to be Fanya. Mm-hmm. In Victory Parade, it's Ruth. I thought it was going to be Rose. I think they get some equal time, but Ruth is really sort of the heart, I think, of this book.
Yeah. Well, it's all this amazing, surreal, absurd, dark humor with Ruth as she becomes Ruthless Ruth, the German Nazi wrestler, and of course
Ruthless Ruth, the killer kraut.
Yeah.
She's never outright called a Nazi.
Oh, but it feels like as if she is. It's implied, but yeah.
It's implied that she's the enemy. Yes.
Yes, the other, the enemy, the German.
I was thinking a lot about the German germ. Yeah, just fresh off the U-boat from Deutschland. I mean, the bitter irony of that is that she's Jewish and she's not even German.
Yeah.
She's a Polish Jew, which is a history that had been hidden from me. Polish Jews coming to Germany in the interwar period to escape war with the Soviet Union, and I guess it's sometimes called the Bolshevik War, which is a period I don't know that much about, but there was a lot of unrest on that side of the world. So there was a huge Polish Jewish community in Berlin in the 1920s, and that is the origin of Ruth. But I was also thinking about the kind of pro wrestling that we grew up with, where during the late Cold War of my childhood, the heel wrestler was always either Iranian or Soviet, right? Mm-hmm. You probably remember that too. Mm-hmm. Hulk Hogan was like the old warrior hero. So consequently, my Yiddish grandmother loved Hulk Hogan because he was the anti-communist. It's, of course, it's kayfabe. It's not real. But I was thinking about that a little bit too, like the characters that have to be developed for wrestling in order for the wrestling story to play out properly.
Yeah, and that's something that Ruth wrestles with, not to, but I wanted to talk about. I just love these severed limbs, and I'm kind of leapfrogging through my notes to Otto Dix, and correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't you playing with and deconstructing the trench painting?
I love that you're making a connection. I assume you're talking about Triptychon de Krieg.
Yes, I am. I'm talking about that little short comic you did, and I'm talking about the way you incorporate fine art into. I mean, comics is fine art in its own right, but the way you integrate other art into your art.
Well, so I love that you're making the connection between Triptychon de Krieg and this spread that we're looking at. So I assume people are going to be listening to this and not watching video. So we're looking at the spread that is Rose's lover, George, having a nightmare about severed limbs being planted in a victory garden. I actually was not thinking about that painting when I did this, but I did have that painting over my desk. I had a bad print of that painting over my desk the entire time that I worked on this. And there's a pair of inverted severed, well, they're not, you can't tell if they're severed or not, inverted bullet-ridden legs in the center panel of that painting, of Otto Dix's painting that we're talking about,
Yeah,
that I've copied again and again into my comics. So it shows up in some nonfiction work of mine, and it shows up much later in this book, in the Buchenwald part. Then there's another Otto Dix painting that I copied entirely called The Scat Players from 1920. There's Otto Dix informs a lot of my work. Also, a lot of his contemporaries, the Neue Sachlichkeit painters in general, I feel are my direct ancestors artistically.
well, I was looking for the Scat Players. I can't seem to find it for some reason.
Are you looking for the direct homage to the Scat Players? It's going to be in the Berlin flashback section. It might be after the part you're looking at.
Oh, here,
Yeah,
here we go.
there it
Yeah. There it
So
is.
in this painting, the woman is not in the original painting. She is an import from a common subject in that time period. Dix and a lot of other painters of that era painted war widows who had turned to sex work in order to support themselves in the terrible economy of Weimar Germany. So that's who she is in there. That's Ruth's mother. And it was a perfect opportunity to kind of pay homage to those women and those paintings of those women. It was sort of a magical moment that happened when I realized I could do that. I could put her into this painting.
Do you think of yourself as a trailblazer, since the comics is still going through these growing pains and becoming more and more legitimized as art? Or sometimes we say that those arguments are done with, but yet they're not quite done with. Do you think of yourself that way, or are you too close to it to even?
Well, whether I'm a trailblazer or not, I think has to be left up to others to decide. I think the trailblazers in our little corner of comics are, well, I don't know. Are there trailblazers in every generation? I feel like Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb and Diane Newman and Phoebe Gleckner and people like that really blazed the trail that I consider myself to be on in comics.
Yeah.
And also the Raw people, the Hernandez brothers, so many others. I guess, I spent a lot of time in my youth being mad about trying to legitimize comics. And then it became a thing that every university wanted to teach.
Yeah.
And
things are coming to a head.
Yeah, they are. And it's interesting to see. I feel like, I wonder if I guess I don't want to change the subject. We're getting into the topic of comics education, which is a whole other topic. But I think scholars can decide who the trailblazers of my generation are. I think I will stick to making the work. I don't know if I'm blazing any trails.
Okay, fair enough. I my mind is racing, and I'm tearing through my notes so um, audaciously. I don't know what word to use because I wanted to keep to a certain pace, and I was trying to keep neatly to my questions, but I keep jumping around, which maybe is for the best. But I'm just going through some pages here. And I mean, you see the beautiful watercolor. Everything's done by hand, and well, that's a whole thing to itself. Everything's done. Well, and there's somebody corrected me and said, "Well, when you're working digitally, you're still working by hand," which is true.
Yeah.
But this is more, let's say, hands-on. I'll use that term, hands-on. Uh,
The terminology that I use with my students is physical,
Physical. There you
because
go.
you're working with physical media and it does unpredictable things
Yeah.
like um, drip and bleed and stain and bloom and crackle and create viscosity. And these are things that digital brushes will never do. Digital brushes will do their own beautiful things. So, and Dylan Horrocks, I believe it was Dylan, who once replied back to me that well, students are still working physically because they're touching the screen with the stylus, which is true. Dylan's right about that too. So I guess sometimes people say analog versus digital, and I think
Oh,
that that's
yeah.
fine too. Although immediately I think of a Moog album when I hear that word. The terminology I really object to is traditional, because I think it's
Yeah.
all tradition. I think if you're drawing, you're doing something within a tradition, and it doesn't matter if you're doing it digitally or with physical media. So I stick to physical.
I like that. Well, I wanted to get back to discussing the tone of the book. I think of a lot of your work. I might describe this as a somber quality to your graphic novels, mixed with a distinct dark humor. Could you talk maybe about your influences, your that absurd, surreal humor? I think it going back maybe goes back to the Zippy the Pinhead, for instance, like one of those first impulses, like, oh, that is so weird. That's so much like me or what I'm doing.
I really love that you mentioned Zippy the Pinhead because that was the first underground comic I ever saw. I had a friend, I was 15 years old, and I had a friend who had a copy of um, Are We Having Fun Yet? And
Hmm.
it completely changed my life. It was the first time I'd read comics since I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. I put away my stacks of Archies and I moved on and did other things. And then I found like I read Zippy the Pinhead. And the absurd humor appealed to me immediately. Like that kind of the particular brand of absurdity went right to my gut and my intellect at the same time. But my influences, I mean, God, like we all have so many. In terms of the dark humor you're picking up on, it's very cultural. So this is like, I want to be really granular and say it's like Polish Jewish humor. It's Ashkenazi Jewish humor, generally speaking.
Hmm.
Um, it would probably be inaccurate of me to say that there's some specifically Polish Jewish version of that, but I'd be curious. I don't know. Maybe I should ask some Lithuanian and Odessan friends about that. I think each region has its own kind of little subtle riff on it, but that dark humor is broadly speaking very Ashkenazi. I think it's one of our best qualities as a people. And I'm being really particular that it's Ashkenazi, as I think that's my culture and I can speak to it. I can't speak about other people's culture. So Sephardic Jews, feel free to DM me and tell me what kind of dark humor you guys have, because I don't know. But there's this kind of in my Polish Jewish culture is very scrappy, absolutely pitch black humor in the worst of situations. And I love that about us so much. There's a tremendous amount of influence on me from vaudeville. It's just kind of always a vaudeville show happening in here. I think
Okay.
there's also, I mean, this is something I've been talking about a lot for the past couple of years. Generationally speaking, the art that was of the highest value when I was coming of age as an artist, really in the early 90s when I was in art school, was very confrontational. So, and you know, this is 80s and 90s era, broadly speaking. There was a lot of very confrontational visual art, comics, music, film. I'm thinking of transgressive film and the no wave music and post no wave bands that I really loved. I grew up on that stuff. Diamante Galas, Lydia Lunch, who was like ubiquitous in the subculture till a few years ago. There's people who were saying stuff that was, they were, the things they were saying and the ways they were saying them were extremely intense, like almost over the top sometimes, but I still love that. I love that stuff so much. So I like very intense music, very intense film, and very intense visual art, and that's the kind of thing that I set out to make. I don't think that I really achieved it until this book.
Ah, there you go. Yeah, I just feel this book is so, well, I wouldn't say it's a leap ahead of Unterzakhn. It's like an evolution, if that's a right way to look at it.
Yeah, for sure.
And I wanted to, here's another, this is a different take on the severed limbs. Maybe these aren't severed necessarily, but they kind of echo that the disquieting feeling.
So what's happening here is, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all. Go, please continue.
Well, I was going to say what you're seeing here is Ruth's death vision. And as she's dying, she's also sort of back in the world of the Busby Berkeley movie that she saw earlier in the book, which is a movie called The Gang's All Here. And I directly copied some stills from that film early on, the ones with Carmen Miranda in them. So she's back in that world now, except it's kind of disintegrating and becoming assaultive.
Yeah.
You know, you asked about my influences. I mean, film is a really big influence, and as is episodic TV writing. The aesthetics of Busby Berkeley and of Technicolor films in general are really important to me, but the storytelling and the aesthetics in Pedro Almodovar's films are probably the biggest influence on me. The Turkish-German director Fatih Akin is also a big influence, specifically his film Head On, and which was a big influence on Unterzakhn, but here as well. I mean, I could talk about film and episodic writing all night.
I'll just go through a few more pages. And here's more of the gallows humor, having the concentration camp on a roller coaster amusement park ride. And at the very end, where you have the war veteran who's seen it all and says, well, what? And the one guy asked him, what was your role in the war? Nothing much. It was kind of his responses, I remember.
Yes.
Nothing special.
Nothing special.
Nothing. Such a haunting page.
Thank you. I mean, one thing that I came across again and again in my research into soldiers who had liberated concentration camps was that most of them did not talk about it afterwards. There's a person, there's a great book that I used as primary source material for this book. It's a collection of oral histories by Studs Terkel called The Good War. And there's a guy who liberated a concentration camp who says, the husbands never told and the wives never asked. Mm-hmm. In another place, either in that book or someplace else, I came across an account from another American GI who had been present at one of the camp liberations. And he said, this is testimony taken in 1985. And he said, this is the first time in 40 years I'm talking about this. And I suspect that is true in general for people who have survived things like that. Like it's not limited to concentration camps, you know, people who, the percentage of people who survive something like the bombing of Hiroshima or the Cambodian genocide or what is happening now in Gaza or what happened in the Second World War, almost, you know, pick a place on the map, who talk about it versus those who do not, especially those who talk publicly, who make work about it, is probably very small.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Studs Terkel. He's one of my heroes, and he is somebody who knew how to get out of the way, let the person speak their story, say their story, and then guide the narrative, and then walk, and then back away, like a ballet dance, knowing when to walk, step back.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanted to show the other book that's out this year. Well, they're both kind of out during the same time period. You Are Not a Guest, which is a haunting phrase, since the person's basically saying you are not a guest. You are part of what's going on when you're in. I'm sorry, my brain is rattled. We're talking about Poland, isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The person who said that to me was the man who picked me up from the airport the first time I went to Poland, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was in the middle of a profound conversation that we were having. I'm so grateful to that person.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You never know when you're suddenly going to be in some meaningful, significant, maybe brief, but still significant conversation with somebody,
Yeah.
a total stranger.
I'll never forget that conversation.
But this is a beautiful collection, and this is put out by Fieldmouse Press, run by the amazing Rob Claw. But you've already spoken to it, but maybe you could say a little bit more about the wonderful process of. I don't know. It might not work for everyone, but it's almost like a recipe, not to be trite, that you start with an experimental 3 or 4 page work, and then see how that gels, and maybe put it out into the world one way or another, and then maybe a year later you embark on a graphic novel. You don't know if that's going to happen for sure, but do you even maybe you don't tell students to do that, because that sounds so trite to say it, but it is let's say a pattern. It's something that a lot of cartoonists end up doing, and after the fact they can talk about it.
So I think you're referring to that short story, The Blood Road, about going to Buchenwald, the nonfiction story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can address that specific story actually. So that I was in Europe already. I was in Denmark teaching at the animation workshop in Viborg, and I knew that I wanted to research Buchenwald for Victory Parade. I was already working on it. I chose in Buchenwald because it was very easy to find English language writing about it. Like, American soldiers had been the first ones to cross into it. There was a lot of English language testimony. And I knew that it would be easy at some point to get to Berlin, because site-specific research is very important to me when I'm working with a particular historical time and place. So I like to try to go to a place many times to get a feel for what it's like in different weather. With Buchenwald, I knew I would only have one chance, probably. Mm-hmm. So because I was already on the continent, I decided to go visit a friend in Berlin. And I knew that Buchenwald was going to be part of that for research. What I did not know, though, I didn't go there intending to do a nonfiction piece about it, but I had this really wild set of experiences that I wanted to set down on paper, and it was a natural outgrowth of that trip. There are things that happened on that day that I didn't even put in there that would have been equally interesting, but I was limited by the publication. It had to be a certain number of pages. So. And, it wouldn't have diluted the story, but it would have taken it in another direction that probably would have required even more telling. So I wouldn't say that story, The Blood Road, it's not a rehearsal for Victory Parade, but it's a standard practice to take small bites with big projects and just see how it feels. The stories that were directly that were excerpts of Victory Parade that ran in The Believer and a couple of other places early on, where I was just kind of trying out the character, like pushing at the boundaries of who is this character, trying to find out who Ruth is or who Sam is.
Well, I think unless there's a couple of more questions I could throw at you, but one question here, I think I might have to read the So it made sense when when I I wrote this down. Is there something you'd like to add? Maybe something to tell the new generation? Because some things you know or you think you know. And I kind of sometimes I'm talking to somebody that's much younger, and I just assume they know certain things. Um, there's a huge difference between instant facts and really processing information and finding some truth. Is there something that you could say to that about what do you find yourself having to wonder if your students know what you know, or how do you present new information, that kind of stuff?
That's a really important question, I think, as we get significantly older than our students, you know. I guess I do feel like it's my responsibility to transmit knowledge of certain artists or time periods to them, but at the same time, it's a two-way street. It's really important to me that they get to tell me about their worlds, because a lot of my students are from other parts of the world. I have a lot of students from China, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from Korea. Always have some students from India, from parts of Africa. So I don't know their world, and I don't know the artists and the cartoonists that they like. So I like to turn it around and ask them to present on work that they love. I have an assignment where I have everybody choose 3 artists and do a presentation on them to the group. And this is always really interesting and really fun. And then what happens in the course of working with people is, especially if I have the chance to work one-on-one with people and understand kind of a little more broadly what their interests are and what their project is that then I can draw on past experiences that I have, or things that I know about that I think might be relevant to them. Like I'm teaching grad students right now, and every time I meet with one of them, it sparks a kind of something I can share. Like, okay, hey, you know, I think you would really like Linda Barry's comics. I'm going to show you some. Or I think you would really benefit from seeing this particular film. Or, do you know about this painter? I have given the Research Angry Women book to a lot of younger women as a gift. And there's definitely things, like, very broadly speaking, there are things that I don't want to get lost in history. And I think you have to get to a certain age to realize how easily things get memory hold.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, every kind of history, activist history, feminist history, racial justice history, like these are art history. These are all things we have to keep. I don't know, it becomes exhausting after a while if you're trying to keep too many flames, you know, alight, right? So I don't know the answer exactly, except also I think this is a normal part of getting older.
Yeah,
But sorry, go ahead.
I need to tell myself, no, don't digress, because I'm thinking of some other things I could say. I'm thinking about like certain popular myths or lies that are perpetuated. And so that can be a motivation for somebody to go out there and say, well, I need to correct the record, or I need to refresh the record, because people seem to have forgotten that this particular story wasn't just this. It was this,
I mean,
this,
I
and
think
this.
that's the entire mission of the podcast you're wrong about.
Really? Okay. Yes.
I guess, you know, it's funny to see it play out in other ways too. Like a younger, you know, grad student, so she's 20 years younger than me or something, who is working on a project about wellness and diet culture and food and women. And she said something like, it seems like Asian food has gotten very trendy in the US recently. And I was like, I think if by recent you mean like 1970, you know, it's easy to not know these things. Like there's a ton of stuff from before my lifetime that I don't know. I'm always finding out stuff like, what do you mean somebody invented this particular technology or did this particular work of art in 1920 or 1950, you know? I think, though, I feel really strongly about keeping the memory and the knowledge of a lot of artists and works alive. But I also feel equally strong about staying open and curious as an older artist. I think this is how artists keep making amazing work. Like Meredith Monk, I think, is in her 80s and making fresh, beautiful, amazing work. I think of John Cale also, like all of these artists who I think as they get older, get deeper and make more interesting work. And I think that happens when people are curious and have a sense of awe.
Well, unless there's something else you wanted to bring up, that seems like a good place to bring things to a close. Am I missing something?
No.
Did I miss something obvious that I should have brought up? Or
no, I think that was a great interview. Is there anything else you wanted to know?
No, I just want to encourage everyone to seek out Victory Parade. It's just around the corner, coming out in April. So I want to thank you, Leela, for doing this.
Thank you so much, Henry. I really appreciate it. And you asked really great questions.
Thank you.